And if you're still here, quietly listening to every word of this story, then maybe somewhere in it, you saw a reflection of yourself. If you've ever sat in a crowded room and felt completely alone, if you've ever tried to keep a home together by sacrificing your inner peace, if you've ever been called too sensitive, too strong, or too selfish, just because you dared to speak up for yourself, then the sanctuary plan isn't just my story. It might be the beginning of yours. Leave a comment if you've ever walked away from a relationship that made you shrink. Share this video with someone who's still holding on in silence, so they know they're not alone. And if you want to hear more real stories about women who've had the courage to choose themselves, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because every week, I'll share another journey. No fairy tales, no sugarcoating, no apologies. We all deserve a life where our voice isn't treated like an inconvenience. We all deserve a place called home, where no one tells us how to live except ourselves. Thank you for listening. And if today you're standing at the edge, asking yourself, do I dare choose again? Remember this. Courage doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you take the step anyway, even if your heart is shaking. See you in the next video, where we walk together toward the strongest, truest version of ourselves. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 37 years old and live in the northern part of Seattle. If you met me in real life, you'd probably think I'm the type of woman who has everything under control. I'm the lead designer at a major architectural firm, managing multi-million-dollar projects. I have an office overlooking Lake Union, 3 prestigious degrees hanging behind my desk, and a schedule so precisely planned, every hour has a purpose. I've always been a woman of plans. 5-year plans, 10-year plans, even 20. I knew what I wanted and I worked hard, relentlessly, to make it happen. Funny thing is, Nathan Carter, my husband, was never in any of those plans. I met him 12 years ago during a local history workshop at a museum. I was there searching for inspiration for a community space project themed around the past. He was there because of his deep love for civil history. Nathan was a university professor, specializing in American history, and possibly the only man who could talk about the Civil War for hours and still keep me interested. He walked up to me and asked what I thought about a specific point in the presentation. What struck me most was, he didn't comment on my appearance. He said, "Architecture reflects how a society understands itself." That made me pause. We talked for hours about history, design, and a little coffee shop tucked away in an alley I thought only I knew. A week later, we had our first date. A year after that, he proposed, with a 19th century map of Seattle, marked with a small circle over the spot where we met. I said yes without hesitation. In the beginning, our marriage was calm, supportive. Nathan was a good listener, thoughtful. He picked me up after long work days, cooked dinner when I had to stay late, and never once made me feel guilty for having ambition. We were a team. Or at least, that's what I believed. Things only started to shift when I began to understand more about the woman Nathan always referred to as his hero, his mother, Barbara. The first time I met her, I noticed a classic American grace about her. She was a retired attorney, living alone in a large house in the suburbs of Redmond. She invited me to dinner, told charming stories, asked kind questions, and made sure to mention that Nathan had always understood her better than anyone. When she said, "No one has cared for me the way Nathan has since his father passed," I thought it was touching. Now I realize it was a warning. I didn't see it clearly back then. I believed that if I stayed polite, kind, and showed her I truly loved her son, things would be fine. But I was wrong. Barbara didn't want a daughter-in-law. She wanted an ally, someone to inherit her position. And if she couldn't have that, she would settle for control. And that's the one thing I've never known how to surrender. Not as Emily Carter, not as myself. If there's one thing people rarely talk about when it comes to marriage, it's this: relationships don't fall apart in a single day. They break slowly, piece by piece, in the silence of repeated concessions. I don't remember exactly when things started to shift. Maybe it was the first time Barbara called Nathan right in the middle of dinner. He apologized, picked up the phone immediately, listening to his mother talk about how she'd lost her house keys. Nothing serious. But from that night on, it became routine. His phone, always face down, always with the sound on. Every buzz a reminder his mother was waiting. Then Barbara began dropping by, because she was in the neighborhood. At first, I thought she just missed her son like any mother might. but the visits became more frequent, 3 times a week. Then 4 soon. She had a reason to show up nearly every day. A freshly baked apple pie, a new health magazine, a suggestion that Nathan should consider switching his vitamins. I tried to remain polite. I smiled, offered her tea, made conversation. But every time she came, I felt myself stepping back, just a little more. My living space started to carry her fingerprints. The cushions were replaced. The curtains I had chosen for their soft color were taken down because they felt too stuffy. The gas stove was scrubbed over and over again. Still a bit greasy, she'd say. Whenever I made a gentle comment, she'd laugh and respond, "Oh, don't worry, dear, I'm only helping." Nathan's always been particular, you know. I'm just used to it. I told Nathan that I was tired, that I needed personal space. He nodded, said he'd talk to her. But then he forgot, or hesitated, or said he'd mentioned it, but couldn't hold the line. There was always a reason. She's lonely. She means well. She's just trying to help. So little by little, I adjusted. I started coming home later, eating out more, and quietly withdrawing into the only space that hadn't yet been invaded, our bedroom. I began asking myself, was I still living in a marriage, or was I just tagging along in a relationship between mother and son? That question wouldn't leave my mind, and the answer grew clearer by the day. I wasn't the wife. I was merely someone allowed to exist, as long as I didn't disturb the framework they'd maintained for decades. But I wasn't born to be someone's background, and my life was never meant to be designed by someone else, not by my mother-in-law, and certainly not by the man I loved. It didn't stop at the small adjustments. When you allow someone to cross a boundary once without consequence, they begin to treat it as a permanent path. I started to feel, unmistakably, that Barbara was no longer just dropping by or helping out. She was slowly shifting from being a guest to someone who held the keys, both literally and figuratively. One day, I came home earlier than usual after a meeting had been canceled. When I opened the door, I found Barbara standing in the middle of the living room, holding a large envelope. I asked her what she was doing, and she handed me the envelope with a straight face. "I just received a copy of Nathan's bank statement. I think it's time we had a serious talk about the household finances." I froze. That account belonged to both me and Nathan, and I had never shared its statements with anyone. I turned to Nathan, who was quietly prepping something in the kitchen, and asked, doing my best to keep my voice calm, "You gave your mother our bank statements?" He looked uneasy, stumbling for words. He said it was just a regular statement, that she only wanted to make sure we weren't overspending. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to, because the issue wasn't the statement. The issue was that my husband believed it was acceptable for his mother to interfere in our private finances. A week later, as I was preparing to present a design proposal I had poured my heart into, Barbara called me 6 times in a row. Worried it might be urgent, I paused everything and called her back. All she said was, "Do you think the lavender pots I sent go well with your kitchen wall? I'm thinking of ordering a few more." I hung up, hands shaking. For the first time, I saw it clearly. She didn't need a reason. She only needed to feel entitled. And then came the moment that hurt the most. It was a quiet weekend evening. We hosted a small dinner with a few of Nathan's close friends. After the meal, I went into the kitchen to clean up when I overheard Barbara chatting with one of Nathan's old friends. "Emily is brilliant," she said, "but sometimes she's too wrapped up in her career. I've told her again and again she should stay home and cook properly for Nathan. Men need care. But Emily, she keeps chasing ambition." I stood there behind the door, dishes in my hands, as if someone had poured ice water down my back. Not because she was talking behind my back, but because I knew Nathan was sitting right there. And he didn't say a word. That night, when we were back in our bedroom, I said nothing. I quietly shut the door, sat down on the edge of the bed, and stared into the emptiness ahead. Nathan came in a few minutes later. After a long silence, he said softly, "She didn't mean any harm. She's just concerned about me." I turned to him, looked deep into the eyes of the man who once promised me a partnership built on modern values, fairness, and respect. And I asked him one question. "What about me? Do you ever worry about me?" He didn't answer. Or maybe his silence said everything I needed to know. I thought it would stop at the snide remarks. That if I just stayed patient long enough, things would calm down. But some people, once they step across your boundaries without resistance, don't stop. they take another step, and another, until there's no space left for you in your own life. It all began with a lunch I didn't attend. Nathan and Barbara went out together while I was in a client meeting downtown. That afternoon, when I got home, Nathan was visibly excited, like a child who had just received a birthday gift. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, smiling, and whispered in my ear, "You won't believe this. Mom has some great news." I turned to him, forcing a smile. "What news?" He said it quickly, like it was a victory announcement. "Mom's decided to rent out her house and move in with us for a while. Just a few months, to save money and be closer to us." I froze as if someone had doused me with ice water. "S," I repeated, each syllable heavier than the last. "When did we decide this?" When Nathan hesitated, his voice faltering. "Well, Mom and I talked about it. It just made sense. We have the extra room. She's been lonely. And now that she's getting older, it's better for her to have family nearby." I didn't say another word. I walked straight into the bedroom, locked the door behind me, sat down on the bed, and, for the first time in months, I cried. Not because my mother-in-law was moving into my home, but because the man I called my husband, the man I chose to build a life with, no longer saw me as someone who deserved to be consulted. 2 days later, Barbara arrived with 3 suitcases and a new set of curtains. She walked in, looked around as if surveying her own property, and said cheerfully, "That spare room gets great natural light. I'll move a few things around. The bed's too low for my back." Nathan wasn't home at the time. Just her and me. I stood at the doorway of the room, my fingers clenched so tightly that my nails pressed into my palms, but my voice stayed calm. "Don't you think this is something the 3 of us should sit down and discuss together?" Barbara didn't even look up. She kept hanging the curtains as she replied, "Oh, honey, there's nothing to worry about. I won't be any trouble. It's just temporary, until I figure out my next move." Then she turned to me, smiling knowingly. "You'll adjust. You always do." I didn't respond. But something inside me broke. Not just respect, but the belief that Nathan and I were still a team. That feeling vanished the moment I stood there, in my own home, realizing I'd been displaced, not by a stranger, but by the woman my husband could never say no to. And in that exact moment, the idea of having a space of my own was born. A place where no one would walk in uninvited. A place where I could breathe again. And for the first time, I knew if I didn't start planning my way out, I would eventually lose myself for good. When you live with someone long enough, you learn to distinguish between what's simply annoying and what's truly unforgivable. I had endured a long list of annoyances for months, but I never imagined there would come a day when I'd face something that crossed every boundary of trust. That day, I came home earlier than usual. A client meeting had been canceled at the last minute, so I stopped by my usual cafe, grabbed a cappuccino, and drove home at a calm pace. I thought I'd take advantage of the time to tidy up my office and reorganize the draft designs I'd been working on. But when I stepped into the room, the first thing I saw wasn't my sketches. It was a small, faint red light blinking from the bookshelf. I walked closer. It was a tiny indoor camera, discreetly placed among my architecture books. Anyone who walked into the room would be instantly in its frame. I stood there for a few seconds, stunned. Then I quietly removed the camera, carried it downstairs to the kitchen where Barbara was baking cookies. She looked up at me with a smile, as if nothing were out of the ordinary. I placed the camera on the counter. "What is this, Mom?" She glanced at it, then went back to kneading dough. "Oh, I just installed a small camera. I was robbed once, so I'm a bit paranoid. Your office faces the street. If someone breaks in, at least we'd have some footage." I swallowed the wave of anger rising in my chest. "You installed a camera in my office, without asking me." Barbara wiped her flour, covered hands on her apron, and placed them on her hips, as though she were the one being attacked. "I was only thinking about everyone's safety, Emily. You're always so suspicious. What's in that room that needs to be kept private anyway?" I said nothing. I couldn't, because in that moment, I realized Barbara didn't see me as an adult, not as a woman with the right to her own space. To her, I was just another child under her roof, nothing more. And Nathan, the one who should have understood me best, was completely absent from the decision that shattered one of my most sacred boundaries. That evening, I tried to talk to Nathan again. He had come home from teaching exhausted, lying in bed reading. I placed the camera on the nightstand. "I found this in my office." He looked at it, then at me. "Mom said it's just for safety." I nodded slowly. "And you think that's okay? I work in that room every day. That's my personal space." Nathan sighed, setting his book aside. "You're overreacting. She just cares about us. It's a camera. Not a big deal. It's not hurting anyone." I turned away, feeling like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. From that moment on, I knew. Everything I had ever said about boundaries, privacy, and respect had fallen into a void. I didn't need another apology. I needed action. I needed a safe space, not to hide, but to survive. And I understood more clearly than ever before, if I didn't stand up for myself, no one else would. Not even the man I had once trusted the most. Not even the man who had promised to build a home with me. Because that home had already been claimed by someone else. And so I began making my exit plan, not out of revenge, but to stay alive, to protect what little remained of me. The next morning, I called my office and took the day off, not because I was tired, but because I needed absolute stillness, to breathe, to think, and to start planning an escape from the life that was slowly wearing me down, inch by inch. I didn't tell anyone. Not a message, not a word. Nathan had already left early to teach. Barbara was still asleep in the guest room, unaware of anything. I made myself a cup of coffee, opened my laptop, and began searching for real estate listings. I didn't need a mansion. I didn't need anything flashy. I just needed something of my own. A home small enough that no one could slip in uninvited. Far enough that I wouldn't hear a familiar voice dripping with passive judgment, or the quiet footsteps outside my office every morning. And peaceful enough for me to reconnect with the voice inside myself, one I had neglected for far too long. Within a week, I found it, a charming little house in Lake Forest Park, about a 25-minute drive from Seattle. It was old, sturdy. There was a small garden in the back, where a maple tree had already started changing colors. A large window facing east, perfect for placing my desk to catch the morning sun. Nothing luxurious, but it had the one thing I craved most: peace. I used the savings I had quietly set aside from project bonuses. The fund I once thought would go toward a long vacation or a joint investment with Nathan, to make the down payment and begin the purchase process. Everything was in my name. I consulted a lawyer about how to maintain full, independent ownership, separate from any marital assets. Not because I was planning a divorce, but because I no longer trusted anyone enough to hand over my entire life. On days when Nathan had parent-teacher meetings or coached basketball practice, I'd drive out to that little house. I brought sketchbooks, notebooks, rulers, and coffee. I began fixing it up, hinge by hinge, corner by corner. I hired contractors but chose every tile, every curtain, every drawer handle myself. I wasn't working for a deadline or a client. I was building something for me. Because I needed to know that at least one place in the world was entirely mine. Decided by me, decided by me. 3 nights a week. I told Nathan I had to work late. Technically true. I was working. Just not for the firm. I was working for my own life. He never questioned it. He was too busy teaching, managing the sports program, and taking care of Mom. A phrase he used more and more when talking about Barbara. I also started seeing a therapist. We didn't call it marriage counseling. Nathan wasn't ready for that. I told her I needed help healing without losing myself. She helped me re-establish boundaries. She affirmed that what I felt wasn't being too sensitive. Like people always said, that I had the right to be angry, the right to protect my space, and the right to choose. Day by day, brick by brick, page by page, I was rebuilding myself. In my head, I called the house sanctuary, a place of refuge. But over time, I realized it wasn't just a place to run to when my marriage felt unbearable. It was the place where I reconnected with who I really was, a version of me that had been suffocated by kind but sharp words, by long silences with no apology, and by the absence of the one person who should have been standing beside me. I didn't know what the future would hold. But I knew one thing with certainty: this time, I had a way out, and I would never again live in a house where decisions were made without me in the room. When I first began building Sanctuary, I didn't know exactly what I would use it for. I only knew I needed it. As a choice, as an answer I might someday have to give. What I didn't expect was that I would need it so soon. Our 10-year wedding anniversary was approaching. As always, I kept my tradition of planning everything meticulously. I made the guest list, ordered food from Nathan's favorite restaurant, chose the music he always played while cooking dinner. I wanted everything to be warm and beautiful. not to please anyone, but because I still believed that if there was any chance left to salvage something, this day was worth trying. I had planned to give him a special gift, sanctuary, not as a goodbye, but as an invitation. Let's start over. In a new space. Just the two of us. I printed the floor plans on thick paper, added photos of the finished house, and placed them in a sleek cream-colored folder. I included a handwritten letter, explaining why I needed space, the quiet pain I'd been carrying, and that I still wanted to move forward with him if he was willing to change. I placed that folder gently in my handbag, carrying hope. But also, my final boundary. The party started at 7 p.m. Friends, coworkers, family filled the house. Everyone complimented the decor, framed photos along the staircase, a small corner with old wedding gifts, the faint scent of lavender in the air. I smiled. I was good at this part, at making everything look okay. Around 8 p.m., Nathan stepped into the center of the living room, raising his glass of champagne. People began to quiet, turning their attention toward him. I stood beside him, his hand resting lightly on my waist, warm and familiar. Like in the beginning, he started with kind words, thanked everyone, thanked me, said I was his light, his support, his everything. I felt my eyes sting. I told myself I would give him the gift after, and maybe, just maybe, things could change. But then he said a sentence that silenced the room. And because today is such a special occasion, I also have some great news to share. My mom, Barbara, will officially be moving in with us starting next week. No one reacted at first. Most thought it was a joke. Until he went on, we've discussed it thoroughly. She'll be selling her house and moving in with us. It'll help her save on expenses. And it'll bring the 3 generations closer together. Especially since we've been thinking about starting a family. I stood frozen. That last sentence hit me like a punch to the chest. Starting a family, we hadn't talked about that recently. At least, not in a context where his mother would be living with us. I turned to look at Nathan. His face glowed with pride, but in his eyes I didn't see myself. I saw his mother, their plan, and a life that had been decided without me. I glanced down at my bag. The folder was still there, but now it wasn't a gift, it was a lifeline. And that night I realized my invitation was no longer needed, because they had already made it clear I wasn't part of the picture anymore. I don't remember how long I stood there after Nathan's announcement. The room around me blurred. Voices faded into a background noise of clinking glasses and awkward congratulations. In my head, one question echoed on repeat. Did he really think I would stay silent? I took a deep breath, steadying my hand as I set the champagne glass down on the table. Across the room, my eyes met Barbara's. She was smiling, not with joy, but with triumph. The smile of someone who had just moved a chess piece into its perfect place. And in that moment, I understood. No one was going to save me from this. There was no one left to wait for, nothing left to wait on. I stepped forward, gently tapped Nathan's glass 3 times with a silver fork. The room fell quiet again. All eyes turned to me. I smiled, not out of anger, not out of bitterness, but with the calm of someone who was ready. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight to celebrate our 10-year anniversary. I began, my voice clear, steady. Even I was surprised. I had no idea about Nathan's announcement tonight. About my mother-in-law moving in with us. That was a surprise. And since he had a surprise to share, I suppose I should share mine too. I reached into my handbag and pulled out the cream-colored folder. Every movement was deliberate, as if rehearsed long ago. I opened the folder and held up a thick printed photo. A small house nestled among trees, golden evening light hitting its ivory-painted walls, white window frames, and lavender pots hanging by the porch. For the past 4 months, I've been working on something in silence. I bought a house, a place I designed for myself, with the light, the space, and the peace I needed. I didn't intend to live there alone. At first, I hoped it would be a fresh start for both of us. I paused, glancing at Nathan. His face had turned pale, eyes wide with disbelief, tinged with fear. Barbara was no longer smiling. But after tonight, I've realized something. You can only build a home together when both people are present in every decision. When one person makes decisions on behalf of both, it's no longer a marriage, it's a setup. I placed the folder on the table. I'll be moving into that house, tonight, not as punishment, but to breathe and to listen to myself again. The room was silent. I smiled once more and gave a small nod. I wish you all a lovely evening. The party's still going, but I'll be excusing myself. I turned and walked through the stunned crowd, purse in hand, head held high. I didn't know what would be said about me afterward, or what stories would be spun about the woman who left her husband on their anniversary. But I knew one thing for sure. I chose myself, and that is a choice I will never regret. I don't remember how long the drive from the house to Sanctuary took that night. I just know I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call anyone. I didn't cry. There was only the sound of tires rolling over the pavement and the steady thump of my own heartbeat. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, everything was as quiet as always. The little house sat nestled among maple trees, the warm yellow light from the lamp in the living room casting a soft glow. Every detail here was something I had chosen, and for the first time in years, I stepped into a space where no one judged me, no one corrected me, and no one made me feel like a guest in my own life. I set my bag on the chair, took off my shoes, and walked barefoot across the floor that still smelled faintly of varnish. In the small kitchen, I poured myself a glass of water, then sat on the window seat. The one I'd imagined reading in on weekends, with Nathan. If things had gone differently, my phone buzzed. A message from Nathan. The first one, "Where are you?" The second, "We need to talk." Then a call. I let it ring in silence. He had the whole party to talk. He chose to speak alone. Now it was my turn to stay silent. That entire night I didn't sleep, not from pain, but from a strange clarity. A feeling like I had finally pulled out a thorn that had been buried so deep for so long. One I had grown used to, but that had quietly been suffocating me all along. The next morning, I woke early, brewed coffee, and opened my laptop to work as usual. Mornings at Sanctuary were starting to take shape. No interruptions from surprise knocks. No scrutinizing stares when I said I was tired. No unsolicited advice disguised as tender control. 3 days later, Nathan came. I heard his car stop at the gate, then his footsteps along the stone path. He knocked, softly. I opened the door. No defensiveness, but I didn't invite him in either. He stood there, pale, worn out. In his hand was the cream-colored folder I had left behind. His eyes were red. I didn't know if he'd read every word, but I knew he understood. "I never imagined," he began, then paused, "that you'd been preparing all of this for so long." I didn't answer. I waited for the words that truly mattered. "I'm sorry," he finally said. "I just thought you could handle it. Because you're strong. You've always known how to manage things." I took that as a reason not to try harder. I looked at him. For the first time in a long while, I didn't see the man I loved, but the man I once believed could grow with me. And now he stood there, finally able to admit fault, but not yet proven he could change. "I'm not going back to that house, Nathan," I said. "Not now." He nodded. No petting. And that, more than anything, told me he was starting to understand. "I need to see that I'm not alone in this marriage," I continued. "And if we still have a chance, it has to start with you setting boundaries. Not just with your mother, but with yourself." He looked up into my eyes, then said, in a quiet but steady voice, "Then let me start from here. Not to pull you back, but to find myself again, the way you did." I didn't reply, but I opened the door a little wider, and in that calm morning light, in this quiet little house, for the first time, we sat down together. Not as a couple clinging to appearances, but as two people who had wandered far apart, yet were still willing to return if they could find the way. In the weeks that followed, we didn't move back in together. No one came rushing home. There was no tearful reunion or dramatic embrace. Instead, there were short, simple, but honest meetings. A Saturday morning coffee, a weekday lunch, an evening call, not to ask, "Where are you?" but to ask, "How are you today?" Nathan began seeing a therapist on his own, not because I asked, but because he realized he couldn't change by simply saying sorry. In one session, he told me, "I used to think letting my mom have her way was a sign of being a good son. But then I realized if I had to choose between loyalty and fairness, I was hurting the one person who stood beside me every day." I didn't respond with emotion, just a nod, because growth doesn't always come wrapped in poetic words. Sometimes, it's in the courage to look at yourself without defense. Barbara didn't change easily. At first, she called constantly, questioning, blaming, crying. But when she realized Nathan no longer responded to her every emotion, she softened, or at least began to control her need to interfere. Nathan and I continued to meet a few times each week. But unlike before, this time we met not to maintain a routine, but to rebuild trust. We talked about the past, openly. We brought up the disappointments, the wounds. Not to assign blame, but to understand each other better. One late afternoon, I brought him to sanctuary. The sunlight still lingered on the porch. He walked through the house, touched the walls, the shelves I had assembled with my own hands. Then he turned to me and asked, "How did you do all of this without anyone knowing?" I smiled, because I got used to suffering in silence. And when I finally did something for myself, I realized, for the first time, I didn't need anyone's permission. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I don't want you to live like that anymore. If you give me the chance, I'll learn how to protect not just you, but the space that belongs to you." We didn't talk about moving back in right away. I didn't want to rush, and he no longer needed to. We agreed to continue couples therapy, to re-establish boundaries, to write down the moments that had made me feel violated, and to commit that this time, every decision would be made by both of us. Nathan suggested remodeling the main house, the one that had once been a silent battlefield between me and his mother. This time, he handed me a rough design he'd sketched in pencil. It had a private office for me, double doors to block out noise, soundproof walls between the living room and hallway, because he knew I needed solitude to recharge. I looked at the sketch, then at him, and in his eyes, I no longer saw a boy blindly loyal out of guilt, but a man learning how to love a grown woman, with kindness, without control, without conditions. "We can't erase the cracks," I said, "but we can fill them in, and let them mark what we've made it through." He nodded. "I don't need a perfect home, just one rebuilt, with someone who truly wants to stay." And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was holding everything together. I was simply living, deliberately, peacefully, beside someone who was learning how to be with me truthfully. 3 months after that stormy anniversary night, I stood in the kitchen at Sanctuary, brewing a cup of chamomile tea. The golden light of late afternoon streamed through the window, softening the grain of the wooden countertops. I had lived here long enough to make it a part of me. Every mug, every tile on the floor, every lamp in the house stood as quiet witnesses to the greatest decision I'd ever made in my life, to choose myself again. Nathan still lived in the old house, but that house had been transformed, not just in its physical layout, but in the way he lived inside it. Barbara had moved into a senior living community a few blocks away, where she had new friends, her own routine, and just enough distance to allow Nathan and me to maintain healthy boundaries. We continued therapy once a week, not because our marriage was falling apart, but because we had learned that love doesn't sustain itself. It must be nurtured, consciously. We no longer argued over petty things. Neither of us had to shrink parts of ourselves just to keep the peace. If something felt heavy or uncomfortable, we brought it to the table. It was heard, and it was respected. I still lived at Sanctuary, not because I didn't want to return to Nathan, but because I wanted this place to remain a symbol of freedom, of personal voice. Some nights, I stayed there alone, writing, sketching, reflecting. Other nights, Nathan came over. We cooked together, sat on the floor, and read books like two college freshmen again. Sometimes I went to his house and sat in the new office he built. On the door, he had glued small wooden letters that spelled out, "Emily's space." We were no longer a married couple living under the same roof, but we were two people living truthfully beside each other, relearning how to love, without stepping over one another's boundaries. I used to think happiness meant entering a home with someone, building a family, sharing everything. But now I understand. Happiness also means knowing you have the right to walk away from any house that no longer feels like home. And if someone truly loves you, they won't block your way out. They'll quietly follow and learn how to rebuild, together, from the ground up. The lesson I want to leave you with, yes, you, the one listening to this story, is this. If you've ever felt yourself shrinking inside a relationship, if you've had to stay silent just to keep the peace, if you feel like you need permission to simply be yourself, then maybe it's time to pause. Look in the mirror. Look yourself in the eye and ask, am I still here? If the answer is no, be brave enough to start again. Even if it's with one small step, even if that step is just saying, I'm not okay, because no one deserves to be loved at the cost of losing themselves. True love doesn't make you disappear. It makes you more visible than ever. Thank you for listening to my story. If any part of this journey resonates with you, don't hesitate to share your story in the comments. We are never as alone as we think, and who knows? Your truth today might be the light someone else needs. Someone still sitting in the dark, quietly asking, "Do I have the right to choose my life again?" Yes, you always do. If you've ever stayed silent just to keep someone else comfortable, if you've ever sacrificed your dreams, your feelings, or your values just to hold a relationship together, then you don't just need an escape. You deserve a way forward. Leave a comment below if you've ever had to stand up for yourself. Share this video if you know someone who needs a reminder that they have the right to choose. And if this story touched you, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell. Because here, we don't just tell stories. We learn how to rewrite ourselves from the very places we once broke. You are not alone. We're walking toward the light, one step at a time.